Writers are sometimes asked how much of what they set down is drawn from fact and how much from invention. It is not, I think, an entirely unreasonable question, though one to which a perfectly direct answer is seldom possible. In the present case, I might say only this, that certain details of the account which follows were suggested to me by sources I have no particular desire to examine too closely, and that, in arranging them into their present form, I have altered less than might be supposed. Whether the result is to be regarded as fiction or as something uncomfortably adjacent to it, I leave to the listener. Horologium Tenebris, written and read by Christopher Halton. It was with some surprise that I received an invitation from my former mentor, Professor Torrenson, to visit a former rectory in Hertfordshire, which he had lately acquired for what he termed scientific research into certain paranormal phenomena. He wrote with a degree of excitement not entirely in keeping with his usual reserve that he had assembled a small party of 5 academics, each drawn from a different discipline, who had agreed to assist in the experiment and observe its results at first hand. Beyond this he offered little. My surprise was not inconsiderable. Torrenson, it must be understood, was an emeritus professor of classical Greek, a man of considerable reputation, and not one whom I should ever have suspected of entertaining, even in theory, matters so generally consigned to the realm of superstition. The invitation, however, coincided with the long vacation of 1932, during which I was free from my duties at Cambridge, where I held a lectureship in classics. Having no pressing obligations, and I confess a certain curiosity, I resolved to accept and accordingly made arrangements to travel down to Hertfordshire in the early part of June. The former rectory, at which I arrived by motor car, was a substantial red brick building of the late Victorian period. It lacked the refinements one might reasonably expect of a house of that stature, and presented instead a somewhat gaunt and curiously soulless aspect. The windows were of the plain sash variety, and an air of austere neglect was conveyed by the flaking paint and the rank growth of weeds where a lawn might once have been expected. Parking alongside the other motor cars, I removed my luggage and went up to the door. A bell push had been affixed to one side, and upon pressing it I was soon admitted by Torrenson himself, accompanied by the small party of researchers he had assembled. I recognized 2 of them immediately, Howard Morton, the physicist from Cambridge, and John Harrison of Oxford. The others were Michael Morgan, an experimental psychologist, and Richard Parminter, whose work lay in wireless transmission and signal analysis. In another setting, the occasion might have had something of a reunion about it, yet the plain gaunt austerity of the house admitted of no such impression. The hallway was in keeping with the rest of the house. The plain white wallpaper had taken on a curious greyish cast, and hung loose in places, while the painted woodwork was cracked and flaking. The house was, for the most part, devoid of furnishings. Pale impressions of picture frames lingered upon the walls, while scuff marks indelibly recorded where heavier pieces had once stood. An odour of palpable unease permeated throughout. Shaking my hand with evident warmth, Torrenson conducted me on a brief tour of what I could only think to call a 10-bedroom mausoleum, the air of which was close and faintly damp. As we passed along the upper corridor, I became aware of a faint, continuous hum, seemingly issuing from above, though I could not then determine its source. In one of the rooms the door stood partially ajar, and I caught sight, in passing, of what appeared to be a confusion of wires and apparatus arranged upon a large table. Torrenson made no comment, nor did he pause, but continued on as though the matter were of no immediate consequence. "You must not concern yourself with the condition of the place," he said. "It is what I have uncovered here that will engage your academic curiosity, and I venture to think justify your presence. What we are upon, my dear Stephen Morris, may amount to nothing less than a revision of the laws of physics as they are presently understood. He offered no further explanation at that time, and before I could press him, led me instead to a room in somewhat better repair than the rest, fitted with a number of narrow bunk beds and an improvised kitchen. This, he added with a faint note of satisfaction, is where we shall reside. And then it occurred, a faint disturbance, not of sound nor of any discernible movement, but rather a momentary uncertainty of perception. So slight was it that I might almost have dismissed it, had not the impression lingered. I turned to Torrenson. What was that? He smiled, too readily, I thought. You need not trouble yourself, my dear fellow. Howard will, I'm sure, be able to offer you a satisfactory account. Somewhat unsettled and finding no immediate explanation, I later found Howard seated apart, engaged in calculations. Taking a chair beside him, I resolved to raise the matter. I waited a minute or two, and then, quite suddenly, he was gone. There was no movement, no sound. One moment he sat beside me, and the next the chair stood empty. Confused and not a little disturbed, I sought out Torrenson, and gave him as clear an account as I could of what had occurred. He listened without interruption. You must try, he said at length, not to interpret these occurrences by the ordinary standards of cause and effect. The house, if I may put it so, does not entirely conform to them. There are fluctuations, perhaps, during which time itself does not proceed in a uniform manner. One is liable, under such conditions, to observe discrepancies. As he spoke, I became aware of a most disquieting circumstance. Howard entered the room, and then almost immediately entered it again. The first passed across the threshold without remark. The second followed almost upon him, and yet neither appeared conscious of the other's presence. The latter came directly towards me. As a physicist, he said in a low voice, I find myself at a loss to account for what occurs in this house. These fluctuations have a tendency to produce duplications of circumstance. At first I was inclined to regard such appearances as belonging to the past. But that will not do. They are no less real than ourselves. He glanced briefly over his shoulder. Indeed, it is my belief that to them we present much the same appearance, unexpected and not a little alarming. Later that afternoon, I found myself in conversation with Michael Morgan and Richard Parminter in what had once been the drawing room. Upon a folding table between them stood an array of 6 case marine chronometers, which Parminter explained had been set earlier that day as a means of independently verifying the irregularities of which Torrenson had spoken. All were synchronized, he said, tapping one lightly with a pencil. With intolerances I should ordinarily trust without question. Yet upon inspection I observed that 2 now stood several hours in advance, while 3 lagged behind by a similar margin, leaving only 1 maintaining the correct time. Parminter frowned, not theatrically, but with the quiet irritation of a man confronted by a fault he cannot isolate. There is no uniform drift, he added, no common error. Each diverges according to its own inclination. Morgan, who had thus far been silent, spoke without looking up from the instruments. It is not inclination, he said. It is interference. His tone was practical, almost brusque. I have observed similar irregularities in the library, electrical, not mechanical, signals appearing without a source, then vanishing, not random, preceding events rather than following them. He straightened and met my gaze. If there is a disturbance, it is not localized to timekeeping. Neither seemed inclined to speculate beyond that point. and it was Morgan who suggested that I accompany him to the library, where he might better demonstrate the nature of his observations. Here was arranged a small array of apparatus, including a cathode ray oscilloscope and a sensitive galvanometer. The curious point, Morgan said, is that these indications do not invariably coincide with any observable occurrence. Indeed, they will at times precede it. There followed another disturbance. A man appeared, no more than 30 years of age, dressed in a late Victorian morning coat with a clerical collar. He stood not 3 yards from us, regarding both Morgan and myself with an expression of unmistakable alarm. The instruments responded at once. The trace upon the oscillograph leapt sharply, and the galvanometer needle gave a sudden agitated movement. Even as I observed him, the figure grew indistinct, and in the blink of an eye he was no longer there. Morgan remained quite still. "This is the second occasion this morning upon which I have seen that individual," he said at last. "I cannot persuade myself that we are witnessing anything so simple as an apparition." He paused. "It is rather as though he belongs, fully and properly, to another condition of things into which we intrude only by accident." He added more quietly, "I begin to suspect that these disturbances are increasing in frequency, and not entirely within our power to measure." That evening, after a meal of cold ham and tinned peaches taken in near silence, Professor Torrenson rose from the table and addressed us with a quiet solemnity I had not seen in him before. "Gentlemen," he said, "I have not yet shown you the instrument I have constructed. If you will accompany me upstairs, I believe the time has come for you to observe it at work. Words, I find, grow increasingly inadequate. Better that you should see." We followed him up the narrow staircase, our footsteps sounding unnaturally loud on the bare boards. The air on the upper landing was noticeably cooler and carried a faint metallic tang. Torrenson led us into what had once been the principal bedroom, now dominated by a single heavy table positioned near the centre. Upon the table stood the device. It was larger and more forbidding than anything I had expected to find in such a place. A blackened oak cabinet, roughly the size of a travelling trunk, supported a large cathode ray tube mounted horizontally within a brass frame. Surrounding it was an intricate web of wiring coils and condensers, several of which appeared to have been wound by hand. 6 marine chronometers were arranged in a semicircle, each connected by insulated leads to a central distribution board. Thick cables descended through a roughly cut hole in the ceiling from some apparatus on the roof. The whole assembly emitted a low, steady hum that seemed to vibrate not only in the ears but somewhere behind the eyes. Torrenson moved to the far side of the table and laid his hand upon a large bakelite dial. "I shall not bore you with technical particulars tonight," he said. "It is sufficient to say that the instrument brings into a kind of interference those conditions of existence which we are accustomed to regard as separate. At a certain point of adjustment, the separation diminishes. One may then observe, and perhaps in time do more than observe." He nodded to Parminter, who threw a pair of heavy switches. The generator in the cellar coughed into life, and the hum deepened. One by one, the chronometers were set running. Then, with careful deliberation, Torrenson began to adjust the main dial while Howard monitored the oscillograph. For some minutes, nothing remarkable occurred. I began to feel a trifle foolish for the tension that had been building in my chest. Then Howard spoke quietly. "Phase drift commencing. 2.4 seconds. Torrenson turned the dial another fraction. The change when it came was not dramatic but deeply unsettling. It was as though the very quality of the light in the room altered by the smallest degree. The chronometers, which had been ticking in close harmony, began to diverge. One raced ahead. Another slowed until its hands appeared almost to crawl. A third seemed to be moving backward. Morgan's voice was hushed. "The galvanometer is responding strongly." I felt it again. That same faint uncertainty of perception, only now far more pronounced. The edges of objects grew momentarily uncertain, and then quite suddenly a figure appeared on the far side of the room. It was a woman of perhaps 40 years, dressed in a high-collared blouse and long skirt, of the sort fashionable 20 years earlier. She stood near the window, her back partially turned to us, apparently arranging flowers in a vase that wasn't there. For 2 or 3 heartbeats she seemed entirely solid, the late evening light falling across her shoulders. In that moment I caught the faint scent of roses on the air and heard, somewhere below, a child laughing. Then she turned. Her eyes widened as they met mine. The expression on her face was not one of fear, but of profound recognition mixed with horror, as though she had seen not strangers but something impossible intruding into the familiar sanctuary of her own home. Her mouth opened, though no sound emerged. She took one involuntary step backwards, her hand rising toward her throat. "Steady," murmured Torrenson, his fingers making minute adjustments to the dial. "We have a clear concurrence." The woman's form began to flicker. For an instant I had the impression of standing in that same room on a bright autumn afternoon many years ago. The sensation vanished as quickly as it had come. With a final unsteady shimmer, the woman faded from view. The chronometers slowly began to reconverge. The oppressive hum of the device lessened, though it did not entirely cease. Silence held the room for several seconds. It was Harrison who spoke first, his voice unusually strained. "Good God, Torrenson, she saw us. She recognized something." Torrenson's eyes were bright, almost feverish, as he regarded the now empty space by the window. "Yes," he replied softly, "and that, gentlemen, is only the beginning. The dead do not merely linger here. They continue, and with sufficient refinement of the instrument, I believe we shall be able to speak with them directly, not as shades or echoes, but as living minds existing in parallel with our own." He turned towards me, and for the first time I noticed a thin film of perspiration upon his brow, despite the coolness of the room. "Tell me, Stephen," he said, "did you feel it, that momentary sense of displacement?" I could only nod. He smiled, though there was little warmth in it. "Then you begin to understand why this house was chosen. The veil was already thin. My device has merely provided the necessary harmonic key." As we descended the stairs some minutes later, I could not rid myself of the woman's expression. It had not been the look of a ghost confronting the living. It had been the look of a living woman who had suddenly found herself confronted by ghosts. In the hallway, I detained Torrenson by the arm. "Tell me plainly," I said, lowering my voice. "What is it that we have witnessed? Are we, in any true sense, restoring the dead? Or is it rather that their condition of existence is briefly brought into some manner of conjunction with our own?" He regarded me with an expression I could not readily interpret. "I find," I continued, "that I have little comfort in either conclusion. The former suggests an intrusion into matters best left untouched. The latter, that we ourselves may stand upon no more secure a footing than those we have just observed." For a second he did not answer. Then he gently disengaged my hand. "My dear Stephen," he said quietly, "you must not be too eager to impose distinctions where none may properly exist. We are dealing, I think, with something that does not readily admit of such categories." He nodded his head slightly, as though the matter were settled. "Come," he added, with a faint return of his earlier composure, "we shall speak of it further in the morning." I slept poorly that night, The narrow bunk was uncomfortable, but it was not the mattress's hardness that kept me awake. Several times I started from a half-dream, convinced I had heard the low hum of the device rising through the floorboards, or that a woman's silhouette had passed across the pale rectangle of the window. Once I sat bolt upright, certain that someone, or something, had been standing at the foot of my bed. There was nothing there, of course, only the faint moonlight and the heavy silence of the old rectory. Morning brought no relief. A grey, watery light filtered through the uncurtained windows, and the air felt heavier than it had the previous day. We gathered in the makeshift kitchen for breakfast, tea and toast. The conversation was subdued. Even Parminter, usually the most talkative, seemed preoccupied. Torrenson alone appeared invigorated. His eyes were bright and he moved with a restless energy that made me uneasy. When the last cup had been set down, he spoke without preamble. "Gentlemen, last night's demonstration was only a preliminary sounding. Today we shall attempt something more deliberate. The instrument is capable of sustaining a longer concurrence. With careful modulation, I believe we may achieve not merely observation, but exchange." A silence fell over the table. Morgan was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "Exchange? You mean communication?" "Precisely." Torrenson's tone was calm, almost professorial. "If the conditions of existence can be brought into alignment, then thought and speech may pass between them as readily as between ourselves. We have already seen that the other side perceives us. It is only logical to suppose the reverse is also possible." Harrison shifted uncomfortably. "Logical, perhaps, but is it wise? That woman last night was terrified. We are not merely observers any longer, we are intruders." Torrenson regarded him with a faint smile. "And they, my dear Harrison, may regard us in exactly the same light. That is what makes the experiment so valuable. For the first time, we may study the boundary between life and what we have called death, not as a wall, but as a permeable membrane." I found my voice at last. "Professor, you speak as though this were a simple matter of physics. But what we saw yesterday was no laboratory specimen. That woman was alive, fully, painfully alive, in her own time. If we force the breach wider, what damage might we do to her existence, or to ours?" Torrenson's expression softened, almost paternal. "Stephen, you have always had a classical temperament, a healthy respect for limits, but science advances by testing limits. The phenomena in this house existed before my instrument. I have merely given them form and, I hope, controllability. To turn back now would be to abandon the most significant discovery any of us is likely to witness in our lifetimes." He rose from the table. "We begin at 10 o'clock. Those who wish to observe may do so. Those who prefer not to participate are under no obligation. The choice is yours." No one moved to leave. As we made our way upstairs once more, Howard fell into step beside me. His face was pale. "I recalibrated the chronometers this morning," he said quietly. 3 of them are already drifting, and the device has not yet been switched on. Whatever Torrenson believes he is controlling, I fear the house itself has begun to resonate in sympathy." I said nothing. But as we entered the principal bedroom once more, and I saw the device awaiting us upon its heavy table, like some patient mechanical contrivance poised for action, a most singular impression came over me. For a moment, no more, I perceived the room as though it had been altered in some essential particular. The light had changed. It was dimmer, with the quality of late evening rather than morning. The apparatus stood silent, and upon the floor, in attitudes of unmistakable finality, lay the bodies of Torrenson and the others. The sight was so clear, so entirely free from distortion, that I could not persuade myself it was any mere trick of vision. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the impression dissolved. The light returned to its former aspect, the hum of the device resumed its low continuous note, and Torrenson, standing beside the table, was in the act of giving some instruction to Parmenter. I must have betrayed something of my discomposure, for Howard glanced at me sharply. I lost no time in relating what I had seen. Torrenson listened, though with less patience than before. "My dear Stephen," he said at length, "you must be on your guard against precisely such impressions. Under conditions of temporal instability, the mind is apt to anticipate, or, if you prefer, to misplace events." He paused, then added with a faint tightening of his expression, "It is even conceivable that what you have described represents not a memory nor a hallucination, but a possibility, one which, I need hardly say, we have no intention of realizing." Howard spoke with some hesitation. "We must proceed with caution, Professor. Even as a physicist, I find myself at a loss to define precisely what we are observing. My conclusions incline toward a scientific explanation, yet I cannot entirely dismiss a more troubling possibility that we are engaging with forces not readily susceptible to our methods." Torrenson turned to him sharply. "I am not unmindful of the difficulty, Howard," he said, with a restraint that did little to conceal his irritation. "But I see no reason to abandon discipline in favour of conjecture. That we do not yet understand a phenomenon is no justification for placing it beyond the reach of reason." We took our places about the table with less ceremony than on the previous evening. No one spoke for some time. Torrenson alone appeared wholly composed, moving between the instruments with a practised assurance that seemed, if anything, more pronounced than before. Even before the generator was engaged, one of the instruments gave a slight irregular movement. Another followed. A third, which had been carefully set but minutes before, showed a divergence so marked that it could not be attributed to any mechanical fault. The dial was advanced. The first figure did not appear suddenly but by degrees. At the far side of the room near the window there formed a region of greater solidity within which colour and form gradually asserted themselves. It was the woman. Now she stood fully within her own surroundings. The room restored about her to its earlier condition. The carpet beneath her feet, the furniture properly arranged, the light of another time falling cleanly through the glass. She moved about the room with quiet familiarity. Then she paused. Slowly she turned. Her gaze came to rest upon me. This time there was no uncertainty. She saw me. A faint sound escaped her. Not a cry of fear, but something nearer to recognition. The sound a mother might make upon seeing danger approach her home. At that same time, the galvanometer needle struck hard against its limit. Howard's voice rose. "The phase is exceeding tolerance. We must reduce." "No," said Torrenson sharply. "Not yet." The woman took a step forward. For an instant she appeared to stand upon the same plane as ourselves, and in that instant I perceived something else. The same room, yet altered. The same figures fallen. Torrenson lay where he now stood. Howard beside him, all motionless. Torrenson advanced the dial once more. The room multiplied. The woman was nearer now, and beyond her I saw the fallen bodies again. "Reduce it!" Howard cried. "For God's sake, reduce it!" Parmenter moved toward the switches. Torrenson raised his hand. "No!" The dial slipped beneath his hand. The hum rose sharply, then broke. The light collapsed back upon itself. The room returned to its ordinary condition with a violence that was wholly without sound. The disturbance returned with dreadful clarity. The furnishings of the earlier time reasserted themselves fully, and she was there, wholly present. She stood near the door, her back against it. Her composure had entirely deserted her. In her expression was the extremity of reason brought to breaking point. "You must go," she said. The words were faint, yet perfectly distinct. Torrenson took a step forward. "My dear madam, do not come nearer." Her hand moved to the folds of her skirt. When it emerged, she held a small pistol. The shots came, strangely diminished. Torrenson fell. Then Harrison, Morgan, Parmenter, Howard. Each fell precisely where I had seen them lying. I alone remained. She turned the weapon towards me. Briefly we regarded one another. There was no hatred in her expression, only a profound and terrible necessity, the resolve of one who believes she is protecting her own time, her own life, her own child. She fired. There was no report. She looked at the pistol in confusion, then back at me. Doubt entered her face. The room faltered, her figure trembled, and she was gone. I found myself standing once more in the bare room. The device stood silent. Torrenson and the others were alive, regarding me with concern. "You are unwell," Torrenson was saying. I could not reply at once, for I knew, with a certainty that admitted no argument, that what I had witnessed was not an aberration, nor a possibility, nor even a warning. It was an occurrence. And from that hour I have carried with me a conviction which no reasoning has been able to dispel, that the event stands not before us as a possibility to be averted, but behind us as a fact imperfectly apprehended. I cannot teach without hearing the low hum beneath my words. Quiet rooms feel watchful. Sometimes my own reflection seems uncertain at the edge of my vision. I fear that when next the conditions of that house are brought into alignment, the sequence will complete itself in all particulars, save perhaps for one. The End.